networking and codable. So just some logistics. Today we're actually going to be having the hack challenge ceremony, so make sure to stay in your seats because we'll do that right after iOS lecture. And attendance is required for that, so make sure to stay here. Okay, so just some review. Can someone tell me which of these types is not an actual HTTP request type? Yes, that's correct. So can someone else tell me what JSON is? Yeah. Yep, that's right. Okay, so last time when I showed you guys an example of a network request, we actually had something called a closure. So we made a request, right? We got some data from a URL, and we had a little piece of code that actually did something with that data, and that was called a closure. So what a closure is pretty much a function that's not formally defined. So it's a self-contained block of functionality, and we don't actually use the func keyword to define it like we would with a function. And it's pretty much a piece of code that we can use in our iOS app. So here's an example of a pretty simple closure. So what it is very much like a function. It takes in two integer values, and it just adds them together. So we have the argument type right here, which is just two ints, and we also define the output type, very much like a function. But notice we don't actually use the func keyword to define the closure. And when we actually call the closure, it pretty much looks like a function. And that's what it really is at its core. But we don't actually use that func keyword to define it. Okay, so some very common use cases of closures in Swift are these functions called map, filter, and sort. So map takes an array of one type and converts it to an array of a different type. So pretty much you can, as you see here, we have this num keyword, which is just any individual element in our array. And we can just take that element and convert it to anything else that we want. So as you can see here, we have an array of type A, which in our first case is just an array of type int, and we can convert it to an array of a completely different type with this function called map. And these curly braces here with a num that returns a Boolean value, that's the closure. We have this argument num, and we have, after the in keyword, this piece of code that we execute inside of our closure. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, cool. So we saw this last week, and this is our first example of networking. And we make a request, and we have a closure that takes in our response and does something with it. So before we just printed our response out, which wasn't really useful, right? We weren't really doing anything, really. But what we actually want to do is convert our response into something. But it's important to note that at first, we don't get this response immediately. So this doesn't just immediately come from the internet. We have to wait some time. So if you guys have the Eatery app installed, if you open it up for the first time, you'll see this little loading indicator, right? So usually what's happening is that we're making a request, and we haven't actually received our response yet. But once we do, then you see that table with all the eateries once we've loaded it. So right here we have this block that says response in, and then that's saying we get a response and we execute some code after we get that response. Okay, so you'll notice here that in our function getClasses, we actually have this argument called completion. And that kind of looks like a closure, right? It has an argument type, which in our case is an array of courses, which we don't have yet. And it also specifies a return type. So that looks very much like a function. In essence, that's what a closure is, right? So that completion argument itself is a closure. But what do we want to actually do with it? Once we get a response, we want to take, if you guys remember, we had this JSON with course information, this array of courses. We want to actually build our array of courses and do something with it somewhere else. So that's why we call it completion. We're saying that once we get this decoded array of courses, we want to put it somewhere else and do something with it. So you'll also notice we have this escaping keyword. So what that means is that all escaping means is that the output of your closure, or whatever piece of code your closure is, that will get executed after this function returns. So we're saying that once we return from get classes, this function right here, we want to call our completion closure. Does that make sense? Perfect. Okay, so some more review. Networking is used to retrieve data, update it, remove it from a database. We use it to interact with data that could be somewhere else. And an example of that is Facebook. So you go onto your Facebook feed and you see a loading indicator or something like that, and then you load all these posts. And those could be Swift models that we get after we decode them from our response. So networking is used to actually fetch data from somewhere else and display it in our app. Okay, so sometimes when we make a network request, we want to actually give our server or wherever we're sending it some data. So a perfect example of this is when we log into something. We want to send our username and our password. That's a perfect example. So there are actually different ways of encoding our data that we send to a server. So one way is URL encoding, where the data that we want to send is actually encoded in the URL string that we send. And another way is JSON encoding. So we can actually construct a JSON object to send our information. Does that make sense? Great. Okay, so you guys have probably heard at some point the term API. So this stands for Application Programming Interface. And what this is, it's a way for your iOS app to actually interact with another application. So a perfect example is Google Calendar. So there are a lot of apps out there that you do something inside the app, and it could create an event and put it in your Google Calendar. So the Google Calendar API is really just a list of requests that you can make from your app to do something in their application in Google. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool. Okay, so last week we got a response from the internet, and it was this JSON, this giant JSON blob, right? But we actually want to take that JSON and convert it into something we can actually use. So we want to talk about how to actually decode data. So this is the networking you guys saw last week, and this is the data that we got from our URL, and it's this giant JSON object, right? So notice that we have data, we have classes, and classes is an array, and each object in that array is of the same type, right? Look at all the key value pairs. We have name, code, instructor, and enrolled. They all have different values, but they have the same keys. So they all follow the same exact structure. So what we want to do in our iOS app is actually decode our JSON. So what we need to do is actually change something about our model, because in Swift we have this struct course with the same keys that you saw in the JSON. And there's actually a really nice way that we can just immediately decode our JSON into our Swift struct. And we use something called a Json Decoder. It's in the name. And a JSON decoder is pretty much just something we can initialize, and it does all of the work for us. But the way we need to do this is we need to change our model so that it conforms to a new protocol called Codable. All that is that saying if we create a JSON decoder and take our JSON object, it will immediately decode that JSON object into an object of our custom type. Does that make sense? Awesome. So yeah, another important thing to notice is that this object right here, that JSON object, all of the keys in that JSON match the properties in our course struct. So that's something very important. So if we were to have, if that were is enrolled versus just enrolled, we would actually get a decoding error when we tried to decode our JSON object into our struct. Does that make sense? Okay, Jana's going to do a demo for you guys to actually show the data from that URL in our app.
Yeah, so the starter code for this should be on Piazza now if you guys want to download it to follow along. But basically, coming into the starter code, I'll give you guys a minute to launch Xcode. Yeah. So we are using Cocoapods again. So basically the starter code is the completed code from lecture 6 with a couple extra like method headers in there that we're going to fill out today. But to just review how we do the pods, so the Cocopod installation, if you guys go into your like Finder and you go inside the folder, so I have a folder that I unzipped and it unzipped into the L7 starter folder. If I open that and I go into the folder that has like the Xcode proj file and the XC workspace file, so we've evidently already run like pod init and pod install on this project because we already created the XC workspace file. But just to go over how you would do that is you want to make sure you have a terminal window open, so just like a blank terminal window. And then you're going to do the CD keyword. So that stands for like change directory, and we want to CD into the directory or the folder that we have our project in right now. And the easiest way to do that is to just kind of like drag the folder and just drag it into your terminal and then press enter. So now if I do ls to list all the files in my current directory, I see that I have my Xcode proj in here and like the folder that has all of the files in it. Cool. Everyone need a minute to get to the right place? Cool. So, and then just to install your pods, you would do pod install. Since we already have a pod file, or we can take a look at the pod file first. So just like last week, this is a pod file that we created, and we're just installing the Alamo Fire pod, which is the pod we use for networking, and we're installing the SnapKit pod, which we talked about briefly last lecture, but that's just the pod that's like an alternative to using NS layout. Cool. So going back into your terminal, if you just run pod install, so mine already had the pods installed, so it didn't really say like installing Alamo Fire, installing SnapKit, but at the end you should always have pod installation complete. Everyone good? Cool. So now going back into our code, if we take a look at Network Manager, we have the get classes function that we wrote last lecture, and basically all we did was call the endpoint, which was this one up here. So if we go and look inside here, this URL or endpoint just has this JSON in it that we grabbed from the internet, and then we, on a success case, just printed it. So just to go over that one more time, if we run this as is right now, we have a blank screen, but we see that we did in fact retrieve the data and print it out. So now, like Matthew talked about, our goal is to be able to like decode this JSON that we got back from the network and like kind of change them into our course objects. So we have this file called course.swift that contains this course struct in it. And like Matthew said, it's really important that if you're trying to conform to Codable, that your variable names match your JSON exactly. So I have the name keyword, code, instructor, and enrolled exactly as they are in the JSON. And then make sure you conform to Codable with the like colon notation like we use to conform to like the UI table view delegates and all of that. So if we think about it, this course model actually only represents a single element inside this classes array. So what we need to do in order to be able to decode this entire JSON is to make structs or models for every single entry. So we have inside of the entire JSON a data entry that is of type or contains a keyword called classes, and then classes contains an array of courses. So if we go back in here, we can declare a new struct. So we're going to start with writing the struct for this classes here. So I'm just going to call that courses data response. Make sure you conform to Codable if you're trying to decode it. And then this model all it contains is this one entry called classes. So I'm going to do var classes, and its type is an array of courses. So we can pass in the course struct that we made before. Cool. So then the next thing we need to do is create one more struct for the data one. And similarly, we're just going to do struct courses response. Make sure you conform to Codeable. And then your single variable inside here is data. So I have var data. And can anyone guess what I want to set its type to if I'm trying to decode it exactly from what matches here? Yeah.
Classes. An array of classes.
So not exactly. We already have, or do you mean like an array of like this classes?
Yeah.
So classes is just the variable name. What is the like model that contains classes?
Course.
So courses is the type of just this, but the data type for this entire like structure that contains classes, yeah.
Courses data response.
Yeah, so data is of type courses data response because we want this entire like big thing inside here. And then that we have represented with our courses data response struct. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Cool. So now we set up all of our structs that we need. We can go back into Network Manager and start to decode this the way we want. So we're just going to start from scratch. So what we do to make a request is alamofire.request. And then the first parameter is the URL or the endpoint that we want to hit. And we have that one up here just in the variable endpoint. The type of method that we're making is the same as last time. It's a GET request, so we can just do .get. And then for this example, we have no parameters because we're not passing any information along with it. And if we have no parameters, we have no parameter encoding, so we can just kind of get rid of the rest of the arguments. Cool. And then the next thing we want to do is to validate our request. And then we're going to call .response data. So you'll see that response data takes in a completion handler, which Matthew went over a little bit in the slides right before this. But to kind of like reiterate, you can kind of think of a completion handler as the function you want to run once your function completes. So if you think about making a network request, oftentimes you'll see like a loading screen or like it takes some time. You don't get it immediately. So when we fire this request and do .validate.response data, we communicate with the network. We're not getting our data back like instantaneously. And we don't want to freeze our app and wait for that information to come back because we want to be able to kind of like update our UI accordingly or kind of do other functions instead of just stalling and waiting for the data, especially if you have like a huge chunk of data that you're trying to load. So what you can do is fire off this request and then pass in a closure, or in this case, the parameter name is completion handler, that you want to run once that data does finally come back from the network. So what you can do is you can double click on this blue box or just press enter one more time and it changes it into this structure or this syntax. And then we can capture the response or set like a variable name for the response data that comes back. So I'm just going to call it response. And then this block here that just says like code right now is the code that will run once the response comes back. And then we can refer to the data that we got back with this variable response. Cool. Does that make sense? Cool. So then with this response, it's similar to last time. We're going to switch on its type. So response.result, because we want to be able to handle like a success case and a failure case differently. So we're going to do a switch statement, and then there's a success case where we want to get some data out of it, and we're just going to fill in the failure case. And then we can just, in the case of an error, we're just going to print our error. And we're going to use localized description to get a nice description of the error. And then in the success case, instead of just printing it out like last time, we want to decode our response. So we know our data is going to come back to us in a JSON format, so we can use a JSON decoder like Matthew talked about in order to decode it into our courses. So to create a JSON decoder, you just do let JSON decoder equal, or you name it something else if you want, but you're going to do the JSON decoder. Cool. And now we can use this JSON decoder that we've created to decode the data. So the way we do this is because a JSON decoder may fail, we want to make sure we wrap it properly so that if it fails, nothing bad happens or our app doesn't crash completely. So we can use if-lets again. So if-let courses data equal, we're going to use a try statement. So this is similar to a try in any other language. Basically, we're trying something and it may have a nil result or an optional result. And then try JSON decoder. And if you named your thing JSON decoder, make sure you're using the object that you created and not the actual JSON decoder type. So in my case, it's the one that's lowercase. And then it has a .decode function. So if we look at the arguments, it's expecting a type, which is the type that we want to decode our data into. And the from parameter is the data that we're trying to decode from. So in our case, our data we just called data. We're decoding from that. And the type we want to decode into is that overarching courses response type that we created. So if we go back to course, our overarching one that kind of encapsulated this whole thing is courses response. So going back into Network Manager, the type that I want to decode into is courses response. And just to refer to the class, we always use the .self keyword. And because that's an if-let, we're going to put all the code for if it succeeds inside the brackets. Cool. Does everyone understand the .decode stuff right now? Cool. So now, assuming our JSON decoder decoded successfully, we have a courses response object in courses that's called courses data. So in order to get the classes from courses data, we can access its properties just like we would any other variable or type that we created. So I'm just going to do let classes equal. So courses data was my type courses response, which has a data property, and the data property has an array of classes. So kind of looking back at this structure from the JSON, our courses data corresponds to the entire thing, and then we do .data to access this property, and then we do .classes in order to access this key value pair. And now I have my array of classes that I wanted to get from the JSON. Does that make sense? Cool. So what we want to do now is we want to be able to use these classes to kind of create a table view in our app. So before we just had this empty screen that just said courses shopping cart on top. And if you look inside View Controller right now, we have a table view, and the table view has this class table view cell registered to it. So we're trying to create a table view of courses, which you can kind of infer from the filled-in methods already. Since we're returning courses.count, we're configuring it for a course in a courses array. We want to be able to take these classes and set that to our courses array inside View Controller. Now, in order to do that, we need to have a way to kind of communicate between View Controller and Network Manager. And we're going to use completion handlers again to do that. It'll make more sense when we connect it all together. But first, we're just going to add a completion handler parameter to our getClasses function. So just add completion. We're going to use the escaping keyword, which you guys don't have to worry about too much what that means. Just good practice in most cases to use it. So this was the example in the slides. We want to take an array of courses and just do a void return type. And basically what this means is whenever we call getClasses, so let's say I call getClasses inside View Controller, I'm going to give it a function basically that I want to run once getClasses retrieves all of the data. And the data that getClasses retrieves is of type course, like array of courses. So what I can do is just call completion on the classes that I just decoded. Cool. Does that make sense? Okay, so now if we go back to view controller, we can actually call our getClasses function. So before we just did network manager.getClasses, which isn't right anymore since we added that parameter. So now you'll see getClasses has the completion, and then once again, if you double click on the box or press enter one more time, it changes it into this syntax. So basically, we're calling getClasses. We're going to store like its result once it comes back inside the parameter that we put here. So I'm just going to call that courses. And then after I receive courses from my network call, I want to run some sort of code. And basically, this is where I can do self.courses. So view controller already has an empty array called courses, and I'm just going to set that equal to the courses that I got back from calling the network. Now, does anyone remember what we have to do in order to get our table view to update our data or show our new data accordingly? Yeah, so normally we would just do table view.reload data. And then inside any closure, you normally just have to refer to your own variables as self. But this isn't exactly what we want to do in this case because of like the fact that our network calls kind of run in the background. Like I said before, we don't want like our network calls to be running on the same thread as everything else because it would just cause our app to freeze while waiting for it. So we do the network calls in the background. But when we want to update UI, since that's very important because that's like what the user sees, we want that to happen basically as soon as possible. So as soon as we get our information, we want to be able to reload our table view. So in order to do that, we're going to use dispatch queue.main. So this accesses basically like the main thread that like operations are running on in our app. We're going to do an asynchronous dispatch queue.main.async. And then inside here is where we want to call self.tableview.reload data. So we're going to move that inside here. And then basically you can think of this as just making sure that your UI updates as soon as possible. Cool. So if we run our app now, we'll see that we actually got our data, we set it to our courses array, and our table view is able to update and reflect the information that we got from this JSON accordingly. So I have my first class, that's Intro to iOS Development, with the correct code, and then anything that I'm enrolled in is green, anything I'm not enrolled in is red. So we're actually going to kind of like step into our code and see what happened, just to like kind of get a better understanding of how like the data is flowing. If you guys have used breakpoints in other languages where you can like execute your code and set a point where you want it to stop, we can do the same thing in Swift. So in order to do that, you just hover over the line number and just click on it, and it puts this like blue flag on it. And basically that means when I run my app, when I hit this line of code, before I execute it, I want to stop. And that will allow us to kind of investigate what the values of certain variables are at the point when it stopped. So I'm going to put one on line 62 here. I'm going to put one on line 63. And then if you go to network manager.getClasses, so you can do control command and then click on something to go to like where it's defined, or you can right click and select jump to definition to go to where it's defined. And then we want to make sure we're doing the one inside network manager. And I'm going to put a breakpoint inside here. So basically I want it to stop right before I make my request, and I want it to stop inside this code where I'm like starting to make my request. So if I try to run this again right now, okay, so you'll see I've hit my first breakpoint. So I haven't yet made my like network manager.get classes. But if you go inside your console, so normally where like information is printed out, you can do PO, which just stands for print out, and then you can kind of print out any variable. So right now I'm inside view controller, and view controller has an array called courses, and right now, as we expect, it's empty because we haven't received our data yet. And then something a little unintuitive is, since we did line 62 and line 63, we kind of like expect them to like run right after each other. But in our case, we're making a network request, so if you press the button, the third from the left, it's like a bar and then a triangle, it'll continue your execution of your app from where you stopped it. And we'll see that we get stopped inside get classes. So I made this call, and then Alamo Fire is going to fire off the request. And then let's add one more breakpoint here. So if I run it again, we'll see that I have entered, so I've gotten my response back at this point. I've entered my decoding. So right now, let's step one more so we can see what is in classes. So if I print out classes, you'll see that now we have our JSON like information, but in the type of our models already. So like this is an object of type course that has the information based on like decoding that from the JSON. And now if we run it again, can anyone guess where in the code I'm going to go if I try to resume my app right now? Anyone have any idea? Okay, so because I called this network manager.get classes from view controller, and I put that like closure code inside view controller, what this is going to do is go back into view controller. So now I'm assigning self.courses equal to courses, where courses is what I just printed out in the bottom right, and self.courses is the array inside view controller. So now if I run it, we'll see we've pulled that information into our table view. Well, does that make sense? Cool. So another thing you can do is if you go to the left bar and then do the second from the right icon, you can see all the breakpoints you've put and then just delete all of them. So you don't have to individually go to each of those to turn them off. Cool. So now we've made a GET request. What we want to do now is make a POST request. So like Matthew said, oftentimes we can make POST requests to send information, and a perfect example of this is like a login, where you're kind of sending along an email and a password to log into some website. So what we're going to use is this API. This is kind of just like an example API that's on the internet for you to just test endpoints. And then the one we're going to use is a login. So we'll see over here, this is a POST request, and the parameters that it's expecting are an email and a password, and this is the response we'd get back if it was successful. So if we go back to login, what we want to do is make an Alamo Fire request. So we do Alamo Fire.request, and then this time our URL is this post endpoint one, so that's the website I was just at. So we're going to pass in post endpoint. The method this time is a post request instead of a get request, so we can do .post. And then this time we actually have parameters. We want to pass our email and our password, which we've already like captured as these arguments to our login network call. So what we're going to do is create a dictionary, basically. I'm going to do let parameters of type string, since we have key value pairs, and our keys are strings for JSON. We're going to just do any, even though obviously from this example we can tell that it's an email and a password. You can use any in case you weren't sure. And then we're just going to construct our basically model JSON to pass in our email. So I have an email and the value here is going to be this email. And I also have a password. And that's password. Cool. So now I've set up my parameters. I can pass in my parameters here. And then for the encoding, parameters. For our encoding, we have several options. So if we go back to this like sample and we like pick a different one, we can see that like this one has like page equals to like appended to its URL. So that kind of encoding for parameters is what we would use for like URL encoding. But if we go back to our example, these parameters aren't actually like appended to the end of our URL, and instead it's kind of passed through as like a JSON object when we make our request. So the type of encoding that we want to use is JSON encoding. And just like that, default. And then we can get rid of the headers. Cool. And then if you were kind of doing the other type of encoding, you would use URL encoding dot default. So that's the kind where it was like the question mark and the parameters were appended to the end of the URL. Cool. So once again, we need to validate, and then we want to call response data. And then double click on the blue box to change it to this sort of syntax. And then I'm just going to use the same like parameter name. I want to capture the response just with response. So if you can tell, this gets like very repetitive when you're making responses. And once again, I want to do switching on my result to handle the success case and the failure case. So what I'm going to do is just copy and paste this. So copy the entire switch statement and the two cases. I'm going to paste that in this code section. So this isn't exactly what I want to do, because if I were to run this exactly, it would try to decode the response into a course, which obviously is not going to work because there's a different number of fields, there's the field names are not the same. Like Matthew said, they would have to be the same in order for Json Decoder to work successfully. So let's change this. So I still want to try to decode the JSON I get back, but I need to create a new struct to represent this response. So if we look back at the website, the response is a dictionary with a single argument that's just token. So what I'm going to do is create a new struct. So file, new file. Make a new Swift file. I'm just going to call it user. And then inside here, I'm going to write my new struct that represents the response that I'm getting back from this login API request. Make sure you conform to Codeable. And then the single variable in this response was a variable called, or a key called token. So I'm going to do key, or token, and it's of type string. Cool. Now I can go back into Network Manager. And instead of trying to decode into a course's response, I'm going to decode into a user. Now this time, we didn't provide any like completion handler because we're not actually doing anything with the token that we're getting back. But if you were like creating a real app with like a login functionality, you'd probably want to have a completion handler that reports back to your view controller like this person logged in successfully, and then you like transition to a different screen, or in the case of an error, like pop in an alert like wrong password or invalid user. But for our case, we're just going to print the token so we can see that we got back the information successfully. I'm going to rename this to user data because courses data doesn't make sense. So I can print out user data dot token. Cool. Does that make sense to everybody? So now if we go back into view controller, we can write a login function that calls this. And then what we want to do is network manager dot login, and we need to provide an email and a password. So the way this like fake API works is you must pass in this exact email and this password in order for it to work. So we have those up here in these parameters. So they're just email and password. So we can pass an email and password. And now if we go back up into view did load and call this function and run our app again, we'll see that because we made that network request, we got the token printed out in our console when that successfully returned. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anyone want to see it like breakpointed so they can see how the data moved? Or is everyone good? Cool. So the next thing we want to do, or just like another example, is we're going to hit this endpoint that we have up here called dog endpoint. So if we take a look at what this looks like, the endpoint that we're going to hit is just going to return a JSON that has a URL in it. But if we go to just random.dog, this is a website that's basically like a random dog API, and every time you reload, there's another dog. But yeah, so the endpoint that we're going to hit is actually it's like endpoint that will return a JSON that has the link to some image or video. So let's see. We have this dog this time. If I were to reload, I get another one. This one is just an image. Let's see what this is. A dog. So we're going to hit this random.dog woof.json endpoint. So if we go back into Network Manager, we have a function header called getRandomDog. So we're going to do another Alamo file request. The endpoint was dog endpoint. This time we're just retrieving some data. In this case, it was JSON. So we're going to use just a get. And we have no parameters, encoding, or headers again. Cool. So like always, dot validate, and then dot response data. And then double click or press return another time to get this syntax. And again, I'm just going to copy the switch cases, put that in the code section, and then make sure I call this response again. So this time, we get JSON back, and that JSON had this just a single argument that was URL. So that means I need to create another struct again because I want to decode it into this URL. So I'm going to do file, new file, create a new Swift file. I'm just going to call it dog. Cool. So I'm going to create a new struct. I'm going to call it dog. I'm going to make sure I conform to codable so I can decode into this type. And the field I have is just a single field called URL. And once again, we're calling it URL because we need it to match the JSON's key value pairs exactly in order to get a successful decoding. Cool. So if I go back into networkmanager.swift, I can replace user.self with dog.self. I'm going to change this to dog data. Dog data. And then now I want to get the URL out of my dog data. So I can just do let dog data, or let URL equal dog data dot URL to grab the URL out of the JSON. Cool. Does that make sense to everybody? Awesome. So this URL is just a string. So if I were to just send this to my view controller, it wouldn't somehow infer that, oh, this is an image and I need to go retrieve it. So instead what we need to do is make another network request that hits this URL and tries to decode the image there into a UI image that we can use. So we have this function called fetchDogImage that we're going to fill out. And that's going to be alamofire.request again. And the URL is going to be whatever image URL we pass in when we call it. And again, we're just getting some data, so this is a GET request. And we have no parameters, encoding, or headers. We have to validate again, and then do response data again. And again, double click, we get this. We're going to just call our variable response. And then paste our case statements into here. All right, so the error case we're just going to handle the same way, but instead of trying to decode JSON this time, we want to decode our image. So we actually, like, we know this when we hit this URL, which is like the URL I would get from the value. This is not a JSON, this is just an image. So what I want to do, data is just some like generic type of data. It could be a JSON like we did in the other examples, or it could be a UI image or an image. So what we're going to do is, instead of trying to use a JSON decoder to decode it, we're going to do let image equal UI image. And if you open the parentheses to see the constructor options, one of them is taking in data. So this is the one we want to use because the response that we got back from the internet so far, all we know about it is it's of type data. And then we're going to pass in data. So this is actually going to return an optional type because we don't know whether or not we can successfully, or we know because we know what we're passing in, but like Swift doesn't know if this is going to succeed or not. So what we're going to do is do if let to make sure we do this without crashing. For the case where it fails to decode, so in our case, like we saw before, we can get videos from that JSON and we are not supporting videos. So in that case, we're just going to come into here and print invalid image data because it's going to be a video and not, it won't successfully change into a UI image. So now here, I have my dog image, and now what I want to do is call my completion handler and like send back the image I got. So you can see the completion parameter for fetch dog image is expecting a UI image. So I can just do completion and pass the image that I kind of decoded from the data. Cool. Does this one make sense to everybody? Cool. So now if we come back up to get random dog, what I've done up to this point is get the URL for the image. So I've just gotten this string out of the JSON. What I want to do is call fetch dog image. I want to get the image at the URL that I decoded out. And then fetch dog image is expecting a completion, or like basically the function we want to run when it's finished. So what we're going to do is, because we're going to call get random dog from our view controller, because that's where we're going to actually display the image we get back, we want to add a completion to get random dog just like we had for get classes, except this time it's going to be a UI image that it's going to send back, and it's just going to display it. So the return for that like function would be void, and then we can just pass in the completion to the fetch dog images completion. Or not. Oh, I forgot to call it escaping. Cool. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool. So now I can actually call this get random dog network request from my view controller. Does anyone need a minute to get this down? Okay, so we can go back to view controller and write a new function. So I'm going to do get random dog. And just like the other requests, I'm going to do network manager dot. And this time I'm doing get random dog. I'm going to return again. And then I'm just going to say call the image dog image. So network manager, I'm going to call network manager's get random dog function. It's going to hit that dog JSON endpoint, which then in turn is going to call our own network manager function to get the image from that URL. And then that image that we finally receive is going to be returned, and I can now refer to it with this dog image parameter. So since I'm making, we can see we have this dog image view parameter, or property inside our view controller, and I want to update the image view's image to be the dog image that we just got off the internet. So I'm going to do, because this is a UI update again, I'm going to put it inside dispatch queue.main.async. And then in here is where I'm going to update the dog image view image to be the dog image I just got from the internet. And then we have to use self because we're inside a closure. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool. So now if I go back to the top of this file and I go back into view.load, and in addition to all of our network calls we've already made, I call getRandomDog, and I run my app again. We see that we get dog that we got from the internet. All right. So what this does, if we put in our breakpoints just on our dog, we have network manager.getRandomDog. I'm going to put one inside the completion. First, I have getRandomDog, so I'm going to decode it, and then call fetchDogImage, which will decode it. So if I run this again, just to show like how the network calls are being processed. First, I hit where I'm calling network manager, and then notice right now I have a blank screen, so nothing really has like finished returning yet. Now, when I breakpoint, because I've hit fetchDogImage, we see that like our network calls to get the classes has already returned. So even though we're running this like function to get random dogs, other things are still happening simultaneously. So if I resume again, this time it said invalid image data. So it's possible that this time maybe it was a movie instead of an image. So if we do that one more time to try to get it to give us an image, so we step in, let's print out the URL this time just to see what we're trying to get. Okay, so this time we're getting a JPEG, so it should complete successfully. Yeah, so completion image. So if I just print out the image, it doesn't really like tell us anything because like it's not going to display in the console, but we see that now we have constructed a UI image. If I resume one more time, I'm coming back to the completion that I passed in, and now I'm updating my image view. And now I have a dog on my screen. Cool. And then we're a little short on time, but one last thing we're going to go over that's like just kind of fun. I'm going to delete all of these breakpoints. We have this thing called timer in here, and what you can use a timer for is to kind of like time different like function calls. So what we're going to do is do timer equals timer.scheduledTimer. And we want the one that has a target and a selector. So what a scheduled timer is, you can specify a time interval. So I want to get a new dog image, let's say every 3 seconds. I can put 3 for my time interval. My target, so basically where like what I want to modify with my timer, is inside view controller. So I'm going to say my target is self. My selector is basically what I want to run every 3 seconds. So this is kind of like a button where you had to use like hashtag selector and then put in the function name. So we have getRandomDog this time. And just like we had to do with buttons, anything that you do a selector with, you have to add that Objective-C notation in front of. And then user info you can just set to nil. And because I want this to happen every 3 seconds, instead of just like wait for 3 seconds and then only happen once, I'm going to say repeats is true. Cool. I'm just going to get rid of the like manual call to getRandomDog and then run it again. And now every 3 seconds about, well, that time we got an invalid image, so if we wait 3 more seconds, we got another one. There we go. So this time we got an image, and if the next one, yeah. So every 3 seconds we try to get a new dog image from the internet. Cool. Does anyone have any questions about how that works? Yeah.
There was an error I got in the course file where it says like course data response is not conformed to
What do you have inside course? You want to answer it?
Did you add Codable to course struct? Thank you.
There you go. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Yeah.
How are you supposed to go through Breakpoint?
Like to add a breakpoint?
No, how are you supposed to, when it goes to Breakpoint, how are you supposed to keep it running?
So the one, let's make this bigger. It would be, or let's try breakpoint and just run it. All right, so you hit the breakpoint, and it's the one that's like a rectangle and then a triangle. Then you press that, and it'll just resume. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. All right, so the action item, the only one is we are starting our hack challenge ceremony in like 3 minutes, so stay here for that. And then after we kind of go through that whole team formation process, there's going to be a little demo on GitHub if you guys want to stay for that, so you can use GitHub for your hack challenge projects. We also have one more assignment that we'll be releasing that will get you guys familiarized with making calls to APIs, and it'll be due in a week on Sunday like the projects normally are. Cool.